In this lesson, we're going to learn about rendering ice particles and the various steps we need to take before we can see them inside of a render. So here's where we left off, and you can open up the project file 11 underscore fixed collision get data end. So we have our particles flying through our scene in a nice manner. So now we would like to color them and sort of see a preview. So inside of Softimage, if you're using the default Softimage interaction model, you can hold the Q key and left click and drag to draw out a render region. And this will give us a preview of what the render will look like. However, at the current time, with our particles, we can barely see anything. That's because we're currently using the particle type point. Now, if we want to render this, we probably want to use something like a sphere or a capsule. So let's change the particle type we're using inside of our emit from null. So let's double click this. And as you can see under shape, we have quite a few different options. Now, of course, if you want something like disks or cubes, you can use a box. But for our purposes, we'll be using a sphere during this course. However, these other types do have their uses depending on the specific type of effect you're going for. So let's change this to sphere, and of course your render will not change. We have to re-simulate the particles first. So let's hit play. And now we can see a bunch of tiny spheres bouncing around inside of our beaker. Now right now they don't look very good, and they're very small, so let's increase their size. So let's again go back into the emit from null, and down here in this initial value we can increase their size. So let's increase it to something like 0.6. And again, we'll need to re-simulate to view our change. Now we can see that our particles are very large indeed. So now we can see they're filling up our beaker. Now there's a little highlight here that I want to get rid of on my beaker. So let's just quickly go into our scene, take a look at our light here by double clicking it. Let's just turn off the specular component. So now we can just see our particles. Okay. So whenever we increase the size, we might need to come down to our bounce off surface and increase the offset distance slightly so that the larger particles do not interpenetrate. As we can see, they obviously are. So once we have that, let's just do a quick resim, and let's now add a material. So again, I just held down Q and dragged a render region. Okay. So right now, these are using the default material. So let's select our point cloud. Again, just going to the Explorer. And now let's add a material. So let's go to our render menu, go to material, and let's add in an ice particle volume. And once we add that in, we're going to get the properties of that node. So to see the material on this, we can hit the 7 key to bring up our render tree. And of course, this can be found under the View menu, Rendering, Texturing, Render Tree. So this is currently the connections that are happening to shade our ice particles. And now that we've added that material, we can see them, or we can begin to see them. So as you can see in the render tree, we have a very similar layout to our ice tree. And we have a lot of new nodes that we can use to modify and render our particles. So going over each of these nodes is going to obviously take a little time, so let's just try to modify the two default nodes we get. A particle shaper, which controls the density, which gives us these nice textures and patterns, and the particle renderer, which takes that information in and gives it color and lets us do various things. So the first thing we want to change is the density. As we can see, it's kind of wispy and we can't really see our particles. So of course we could add more particles, but I would really prefer to do this in the renderer instead of having to simulate more particles. So inside of our particle renderer here, let's go down to the volume density and let's increase this up to 150. And now we can see our particles are getting much more dense. Now, while we're here, we might also want to increase the density limit, which lets our particles overlap a little bit further. Now, it's going to be difficult to see until we turn on a few more flags, so let's continue on and take a look at what else we can adjust inside of our particle renderer. So obviously, we can come in and change the particle color, or with this checked off, we're going to be using the default particle color, which we do want to do. We can come over to volume color and change things like the ambience, which is just the amount of almost pure light that is hitting this, and then the diffuse light, which is the light that almost has to use real lighting rules. So let's increase the diffuse light up to 1, and that will bring our particles much brighter. And what I prefer to do is use ambient occlusion with particles because it lets us get some really nice varied effects. So let's turn this on, and let's actually just give this a little bit of a blue color. I want to drag up the blue a little, drag up the red a little, just to get a little bit of color into this image here. Now finally we can go over to volume rendering, but we usually don't want to modify these. If you want to see a perfect preview inside of your render region, you can set the marching detail to high, and that will give us, as you can see, a much nicer result. However, it does slow things down, so I'm just going to keep this on default until later. So now let's look at our particle shaper. And these are, or the default settings for the particle shaper are nice for sort of this complex cloud and complex noise patterns, but I just want some simple particles to look at. So in this irregular shape, let's turn off this intensity, and let's go to cell shape, and let's turn off that intensity as well. And now we're going to get some really nice, soft, and fluffy particles. Okay, so I'm really liking how this is looking, so we can close this and let's just simulate a little further. So I'm going to middle click to see what this looks like with a few more particles in here. Let me zoom out a little so we can see this a little bit better. And let's take a look. Alright, so I think this is looking really nice. So we're using the particle color as white to give us the sort of white outlines. But we're using inside the particle renderer, particle or volume color, we're using the ambient occlusion to give us this nice blue tinting. Now this is a little strong, so what we can of course do is decrease the intensity of the ambient occlusion, just to give this a little bit more of a subtle effect. Okay, this is looking really nice. So just to recap, we went in and used a ice particle volume material on our particle cloud. And then we came in and modified the particle renderer, which gives us, of course, a lot of different options, both to control how dense it is and an override for the particle color if we need it. The volume color, which I really like using the ambient occlusion to give some nice, almost self-shadowing effects. And we came into the particle shaper and reduced some of the irregular and the cell shape to give us a nice, softer look. Now, of course, these changes work because this is the look we're going for. Depending on the situation, you might still need this irregular and cell shape up to a higher intensity value. But this will give us the look we're going for right now. So let me just increase my detail here. And again, this detail is not going to show up in the final render, so you can bring this as low as you want or as high as you want, depending on how nice you want the preview to look inside this render region. Once it actually comes time to render, of course, these settings will not affect the final render. And by these settings, I mean this quality slider on the right-hand side of this render region tool. Okay, so now that we have the material set up for our particles, let's now jump back into our ice tree in the next lesson and learn how we can control our particles a little bit better by using a curve to guide them through this tube.